Emma stood at the hospital window watching the rain streak down the glass, like tears she couldn't shed anymore. The drops raced each other to the bottom of the pane, and she found herself silently cheering for the smaller ones that somehow managed to catch up with the bigger drops. It was a silly game, but it kept her mind busy for a few precious seconds. Behind her, she could hear the soft beeping of machines and the gentle whoosh of the oxygen tank that helped James breathe easier now. The room smelled like antiseptic, and that particular hospital smell that somehow managed to be both clean and sad at the same time. Emma had brought James's favorite pillow from home 3 days ago, along with the small wooden picture frame that usually sat on his nightstand. The photos showed them on their wedding day 22 years ago. James looked so young and nervous in his rented tuxedo while Emma beamed at the camera in her grandmother's altered wedding dress. They both looked like they believed they had forever. Ahead of them now James lay in the hospital bed that the nurses had positioned so he could see out the window when he was awake. The doctors had explained everything to Emma in their careful medical language, but what it came down to was simple and terrible. The illness was taking away James's ability to speak first, and then slowly everything else would follow. It had been 3 weeks since she had heard his voice say her name, and the silence felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. But James had never been much of a talker anyway. Even when they first met at the small bookshop where Emma worked part-time during college, he had been a man of few words. She remembered that Tuesday afternoon when he had walked into the store during her shift. He had browsed the poetry section for nearly an hour, picking up books and reading a few lines before putting them back. Emma had been organizing the romance novels on the other side of the store, but she kept glancing over at him. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he had forgotten to comb it, and he wore a faded blue sweater that had seen better days. There was something gentle about the way he handled the books, like they were precious things that deserved careful attention. When he finally approached the counter, Emma had expected him to ask about a particular author, or maybe request help finding something specific. Instead, James had simply slid a small piece of paper across the wooden counter without saying a word. Emma had unfolded it to find neat handwriting that read, "Coffee tomorrow. The place with the terrible music but excellent pastries on 5th Street. If yes, wave. If no, pretend you never saw this note." Emma had laughed out loud at his unusual approach and given him an enthusiastic wave. James had smiled, then really smiled for the first time since entering the store, and Emma had felt something warm and pleasant settle in her stomach. Their first date had been wonderfully awkward. James had indeed been right about the coffee shop having terrible music. Some kind of experimental jazz that sounded like the musicians were having an argument with their instruments. But the pastries were incredible, and James had been surprisingly easy to talk to once he relaxed. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did say something, it was usually thoughtful or funny, or both. Emma learned that James worked as a carpenter and loved building things with his hands. He told her about the rocking chair he was making for his sister who was expecting her first baby, and how he spent hours sanding each piece until it was perfectly smooth. He asked Emma about her literature classes and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts about the books she was reading. When she mentioned that she loved stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, James had nodded and said, "Those are the best kind of stories, because they remind us that we all have something extraordinary inside us." That comment had stayed with Emma long after their date ended. There was something about James that made her feel like he saw things other people missed. He noticed when the elderly man at the next table was having trouble reading the menu and quietly asked the waitress to bring him the large print version. He left an extra large tip, even though their order had been simple coffee and pastries. When they walked back to Emma's dorm, James had pointed out a small garden hidden between 2 buildings that Emma had walked past hundreds of times without noticing. Over the months that followed, Emma discovered that James had a gift for communication that had nothing to do with words. He would bring her small wildflowers he found during his morning runs. He would leave little notes in her textbooks when she wasn't looking. Simple messages like "You're going to do great on your exam," or "Don't forget to eat lunch today." He remembered that she liked her coffee with extra cream and always ordered it that way without asking. He noticed when she was tired or stressed and would simply take her hand and sit quietly with her until she felt better. Now, 22 years later, Emma realized that their entire relationship had been built on this kind of wordless understanding. James showed love through actions rather than declarations. He proved his feelings through consistency and attention rather than grand romantic gestures. When Emma had been sick with the flu, during their second year of marriage, James had taken a week off work to make her soup and read to her from her favorite books. When she had been worried about her mother's health, James had driven her to visit every weekend for 2 months without ever complaining about the 4-hour round trip. Emma turned away from the window and looked at James lying in the hospital bed. Even unconscious, he somehow managed to look peaceful rather than sick. His dark hair was now streaked with silver, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in their wedding photo, but he was still the same man who had slid that note across the bookstore counter all those years ago. The same man who had spent their entire marriage finding ways to say "I love you," without using those 3 words very often. She walked over to the bed and sat down in the chair the nurses had positioned there for her. James's hand lay on top of the pale blue hospital blanket, and Emma gently placed her own hand over his. His skin felt warm and familiar, despite everything that was happening. For a moment, Emma closed her eyes and tried to remember what his voice sounded like when he said her name. The memory felt fragile, like something that might disappear if she thought about it too hard. When Emma opened her eyes again, James was looking at her. His brown eyes were alert and focused, and for a second it was like having the old James back, completely present and aware. He couldn't speak, but Emma could see in his expression that he was asking if she was okay. This was so typical of James to be worried about her when he was the one lying in a hospital bed connected to machines that helped him breathe. Emma squeezed his hand gently and smiled at him. "I'm okay," she said softly, even though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. James squeezed back, and Emma felt that familiar warmth spread through her chest. They had developed their own language over the years, built on touches and glances and small gestures that meant more than entire conversations. This squeeze meant, "I'm still here. I'm still me. We're still us." The afternoon light coming through the window cast soft patterns on the hospital room walls, and Emma settled back in her chair, still holding James's hand. She didn't need him to speak to know what he was thinking. After 22 years together, some conversations happened without any words at all. The next morning brought the sound of hurried footsteps in the hospital corridor and familiar voices that made James's eyes flutter open with sudden alertness. Emma had been dozing in her chair when she heard Sarah calling her name from down the hallway. Their daughter had driven through the night from her college 3 states away, and Emma could hear the exhaustion and worry in her voice. Even before she appeared in the doorway, Sarah burst into the room, with her backpack still slung over her shoulder and her long brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked so much like Emma had at that age, with the same determined chin and expressive green eyes. Behind her came Michael, their son, who had left his new job in the city the moment Emma had called him. At 25, Michael had James's height and gentle manner, but Emma's quick smile and way of filling silence with warmth. Emma watched as both of her children stopped short when they saw their father in the hospital bed. She knew it was a shock, even though she had tried to prepare them. Over the phone, James looked smaller, somehow surrounded by all the medical equipment, but his face lit up the moment he saw Sarah and Michael. The joy in his expression was so pure and bright that for a moment, Emma forgot about everything else except how much this man loved his children. Sarah dropped her backpack and rushed to the left side of the bed, while Michael approached more cautiously. From the right, Emma could see that Michael was struggling with seeing his father this way. James had always been the strong, steady presence in their family. The one who fixed broken things and solved problems with quiet patience. Now he needed machines to help him breathe, and couldn't even say hello to his own children. But James had never needed words to show his love for Sarah and Michael. When Sarah was little, he had spent entire weekends building her an elaborate dollhouse, complete with tiny furniture he carved himself. He never explained why each room needed to be perfect or why he stayed up late painting miniature picture frames. He simply worked with the focused attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. The dollhouse still sat in Sarah's childhood bedroom, a testament to the kind of father who showed love through creation rather than declaration. With Michael, James had been the parent who taught through example rather than lecture. When Michael was learning to drive, James had sat in the passenger seat with supernatural calm, even when his 16-year-old son had backed into the mailbox or taken corners too fast. He never raised his voice or grabbed the steering wheel in panic. Instead, he would simply say, "Try that again," or, "What do you think happened there?" until Michael figured out how to be a better driver through practice rather than criticism. Now, as James looked at his grown children, Emma could see him taking in every detail of how they had changed since his last clear day. Sarah had cut her hair shorter, and there was a new confidence in her posture that came from surviving her junior year of college. Michael looked more mature too, with the beginnings of lines around his eyes that came from his new job managing a small construction crew. James's eyes moved from one face to the other, as if he was updating his mental pictures of them. Sarah reached for her father's hand and began talking in the rapid way she always did when she was nervous or excited. She told him about her final exams and how she had aced her literature paper on Victorian novels. She pulled out her phone and showed him pictures from her last few weeks at school. Photos of her study group gathered around a table covered with textbooks and coffee cups. Pictures of her dorm room decorated for the spring formal dance. A selfie she had taken with her best friend outside the library, where they spent most of their time. James looked at each photo with complete attention, his eyes bright with interest and pride. He couldn't tell Sarah how beautiful she looked in her formal dress or ask about the young man who appeared in several of the pictures with his arm around her shoulders. But Emma could see in James's expression that he was cataloging every detail, storing away these glimpses of his daughter's life away from home. Michael pulled up a chair on the other side of the bed and began talking about his new job. he explained how he was learning to manage a crew of older carpenters who had been skeptical about taking direction from someone so young. Michael described the house they were currently building and how he had suggested a change to the original design that would make the kitchen more functional. The homeowners had loved his idea, and Michael's confidence had grown with each successful project. As Michael talked about his work, Emma noticed James's eyes becoming more animated. This was the career path James had always hoped his son might choose, not because he wanted Michael to follow exactly in his footsteps, but because he recognized that his son had inherited his love of building and creating. James had taught Michael to use tools when he was barely tall enough to reach the workbench, and had watched with quiet satisfaction as his son developed the same careful attention to detail that made James such a skilled carpenter. When Michael mentioned feeling nervous about living alone in his new apartment, James did something that made Emma's heart ache with its simple perfection. He reached over with obvious effort and tapped his son gently on the chest right over his heart. Then James tapped his own chest in the same spot. The message was as clear as if he had spoken the words aloud. You carry us with you always. You are never really alone because part of us lives inside you. Michael's eyes filled with tears, but he smiled and tapped his own chest in return. This was the kind of communication that had always existed in their family. Important things were often expressed through gestures and actions rather than long conversations. James had taught his children that love was something you demonstrated every day through small, consistent acts of care and attention. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and Michael settled into chairs they had pulled close to the bed. It reminded Emma of family movie nights when the children were small and they would all pile together on the couch with blankets and popcorn. The tradition had continued even as Sarah and Michael grew older, though they had graduated from animated movies to comedies and occasionally serious dramas that led to long discussions afterward. Now they didn't need entertainment or even much conversation, simply being together felt like enough. Sarah showed James more pictures on her phone, including some of the dollhouse which she had photographed to show her roommates. She had told them about her father who had built it entirely by hand, and they had been amazed by the level of detail and craftsmanship. James smiled at these photos with particular warmth, as if remembering all those weekends spent crouched on the floor of Sarah's room, creating something that would last long after she outgrew playing with dolls. Michael talked more about his construction projects and asked James's opinion about different approaches to solving building problems. Even though James couldn't respond verbally, Michael seemed to understand his father's thoughts from his facial expressions and small nods. It was like watching a conversation conducted in a language only they understood, developed over years of working together on projects around the house. As evening approached, Emma realized that this was exactly what James would have wanted. No dramatic scenes or desperate attempts to say everything that had been left unsaid over the years. Just his family gathered around him, sharing the ordinary details of their lives, and letting him know, through their presence, that he was loved and valued, and that his influence on their lives would continue long after he was gone. The room filled with the comfortable quiet that had always characterized their family gatherings. They were people who understood that sometimes the most important conversations happened in the spaces between words, where love existed as a feeling rather than a statement, and where being together was more valuable than any amount of talking. The third day brought a different kind of quiet to the hospital room. James slept more deeply now and for longer periods, but even in his sleep, his hand would search across the blanket until it found Emma's. She had positioned her chair so she could hold his hand while he rested, and sometimes she would feel his fingers tighten slightly around hers, as if even in dreams he was making sure she was still there beside him. The nurses moved around them like careful dancers checking monitors and adjusting the flow of oxygen without making unnecessary noise. They had worked in this ward long enough to recognize when a room held something sacred that shouldn't be disturbed. Nurse Patricia, who had been taking care of James since he arrived, would sometimes pause at the foot of his bed and watch Emma, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. She had seen many families during her 20 years of hospital work, but there was something about the way Emma and James connected without words that reminded her why she had chosen this profession. Dr. Martinez came by in the afternoon, speaking in the soft, measured tones that doctors use when they need to deliver difficult news. Gently, she pulled up a chair beside Emma and explained that James's condition was progressing faster than they had initially hoped. His body was simply getting tired, she said, like a machine that had been running faithfully for years and was finally beginning to slow down. But she was quick to add that James wasn't experiencing pain. The medication was keeping him comfortable, and his awareness was still very much present even when he appeared to be sleeping. Emma nodded as she listened, though part of her mind was focused on the way James's breathing had changed since morning. Each breath seemed more deliberate now, like he was having to think about something that had always been automatic. Dr. Martinez noticed Emma's attention drifting and gently touched her shoulder. "Keep talking to him," she said. "Keep touching him. These connections matter more now than ever before. He can hear you, and he can feel your presence even when his eyes are closed." After Dr. Martinez left, Emma found herself studying James's face more carefully than she had in years. Marriage had a way of making you stop really looking at the person you lived with every day. You saw them, but you didn't always notice the small changes that happened gradually over time. Now, Emma traced with her eyes the lines that had appeared around James's mouth from all the times he had smiled at her bad jokes. She noticed how his eyebrows had grown a little wilder with age, and how there was a small scar on his chin from when he had been building Sarah's dollhouse and a piece of wood had slipped. These details felt precious now, like artifacts from a life fully lived. Emma remembered the night James had gotten that scar. He had been working late in the garage trying to finish a particularly tricky piece of the dollhouse furniture. Emma had brought him a cup of coffee and found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by tiny pieces of wood holding a cloth to his chin. Occupational hazard, he had said with a rueful smile, but he had gone right back to work as soon as the bleeding stopped because he had promised Sarah the dollhouse would be ready for her birthday. That was James in a nutshell. He kept his promises, no matter how small they seemed to other people. When he told Sarah he would teach her to ride a bike without training wheels, he spent 3 weeks running alongside her in the park every evening after work until she finally found her balance. When he promised Michael they would build a treehouse together, he researched proper construction techniques and spent months creating something that was basically a small house suspended in the branches of their backyard oak tree. As evening approached, James opened his eyes and looked directly at Emma with startling clarity. For a moment, it was like having the old James back, completely alert and present and focused on her. The machines continued their quiet beeping, but James seemed to be existing in a space beyond their mechanical sounds. He lifted his hand with obvious effort and touched Emma's cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Then James did something that made Emma's heart stop for a moment. He pressed his palm flat against his chest, right over his heart, and then slowly moved it toward her. The gesture was unmistakable and more eloquent than any words he had ever spoken. He was telling her that his heart belonged to her, not just now but always. That whatever happened next, the love between them would continue in ways that didn't depend on breathing or speaking or physical presence. Emma understood immediately. She placed her own hand on her chest and then reached toward James, completing their silent conversation. "My heart goes to you too," the gesture said. "My love for you doesn't end here." They had created their own language over the years, built on touch and understanding and intuition. Now that private language was carrying them through the most important conversation of their lives. James smiled then, and it was the first real smile Emma had seen from him in days. His whole face seemed to light up with something that looked almost like relief. He had been worried about her, Emma realized. Even in his own difficult situation, he had been concerned about how she would handle what was coming. This exchange of hearts, this wordless promise of continuing love had given him what he needed to let go of that worry. Emma began humming softly the melody of the song that had played during their first dance at their wedding reception. It was an old song even then, something her grandmother had suggested because it had been popular during her own courtship. The lyrics were simple and sweet, about love that lasted through seasons and years and all the changes that life could bring. Emma had always loved the way James held her during that dance, as if she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. Now, as she hummed the familiar melody, Emma could see James's lips moving just slightly, as if he was singing along in his mind. Music had always been a bridge between them when words weren't enough. James couldn't carry a tune to save his life, but he loved listening to Emma sing while she cooked dinner or folded laundry. He would sometimes request specific songs, and Emma would oblige, knowing that her voice made their small house feel more like home. During Sarah's childhood, Emma had sung lullabies every night, and James would stand in the doorway listening until their daughter fell asleep. When Michael was in high school and learning to play guitar, James would sit patiently while his son practiced the same songs over and over again. He never complained about the repetition or the occasional wrong notes because he understood that learning to make music was like learning any other skill. It required patience and practice and someone who believed in you even when you made mistakes. As the last notes of their wedding song faded into the evening air, James opened his eyes one more time and looked at Emma with such profound love that she felt her heart might break from the sheer beauty of it. No words could have expressed what passed between them in that moment. It was gratitude and devotion, and a promise that some connections transcend physical presence. It was 22 years of marriage distilled into a single look that said everything that had ever needed to be said between them. The room grew quiet again, except for the gentle sounds of the machines and James's soft breathing. Emma continued to hold his hand as darkness fell outside the window, and the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm. She didn't need him to speak to know what he was thinking. After all these years together, some conversations happened in the space beyond words where love existed as pure feeling and understanding. The fourth day dawned gray, and still with heavy clouds hanging low over the hospital like a soft blanket. Emma had dozed fitfully in her chair throughout the night, never quite falling in too deep. Sleep because some part of her mind remained alert to every change in James's breathing. When she woke fully, she found him watching her with those gentle brown eyes that had captured her heart so many years ago at the bookstore. His breathing had changed during the night, becoming slower and more deliberate, like he was saving energy for something important. The rhythm was different now, with longer pauses between each breath that made Emma hold her own breath until she heard the next one come. But James's eyes were still alert and aware, and when he saw that she was awake, he managed a small smile that reminded her of all the mornings they had woken up together in their own bed at home. Sarah and Michael arrived early, having spent the night in the family waiting room down the hall. They brought coffee in paper cups and a bag of Emma's favorite blueberry muffins from the bakery near their house, but food seemed impossible now. The smell of coffee filled the room, mixing with the antiseptic hospital odors and creating something that was both comforting and strange. Sarah set the bag of muffins on the windowsill where the morning light made them look like small offerings to whatever forces controlled life and death. The three of them arranged themselves around James's bed like they had done the day before, each finding a place where they could touch him gently. Sarah took his left hand while Michael rested his palm on his father's shoulder. Emma remained in her chair beside the bed where she had been keeping vigil since James had been admitted. They formed a circle of connection around him, and Emma could feel the love flowing between them like an invisible current. James seemed to understand that his family needed something from him today, some kind of blessing or permission or reassurance that would help them carry on after he was gone. With tremendous effort that was visible in the way his face tightened with concentration, he looked at each of them individually. His gaze lingered on each face as if he was taking a final photograph with his heart. When James looked at Sarah, his eyes seemed to say everything he had never put into words about watching her grow from a curious little girl into a confident young woman. The look said, "You are so much stronger than you know, and I am so proud of the person you have become." It spoke of all the times he had helped her with homework without doing it for her, and all the nights he had listened to her teenage problems without trying to fix everything immediately. His expression held memories of dance recitals and school plays, and the day she had left for college with tears in her eyes, but determination in her posture. To Michael, James's look conveyed a different message, but one equally full of love and pride. "Trust yourself, son," his eyes seemed to say. "You have everything you need inside you already." It was the same message James had been giving Michael in different ways throughout his life. When Michael had been afraid to try out for the baseball team, James had simply practiced throwing with him in the backyard every evening until his son felt confident enough to face the tryouts. When Michael had worried about starting his new job, James had reminded him of all the projects they had completed together and how quickly Michael had learned each new skill. When James's gaze finally settled on Emma, the intensity of his expression nearly took her breath away. 22 years of marriage passed between them in that single look. "Thank you," his eyes said. "Thank you for understanding me when I couldn't find the words. Thank you for building a life with me. Thank you for loving me exactly as I am." Emma felt tears running down her cheeks, but they weren't entirely sad tears. Mixed in with the grief was gratitude for having been loved so completely by this quiet, gentle man. Then James did something that would stay with all of them forever. With effort that seemed to cost him greatly, he brought both hands together in front of his chest, right over his heart. He held them there for a moment as if he was gathering something precious. Then, slowly, deliberately, he opened his hands and pushed them outward, toward his family, like he was releasing birds into flight. The gesture was so beautiful and meaningful that, for a moment, none of them could breathe. James was giving them his love not as something to hold on to and mourn, but as something to carry forward into their own lives. He was telling them to take what he had given them and let it live, and grow, and spread to other people. "Don't hold on to grief," the gesture seemed to say, "carry forward the joy we shared." It was the most eloquent speech James had ever given, delivered entirely without sound, but understood perfectly by everyone who witnessed it. Sarah began crying, but she was smiling too, and she pressed her father's hand to her own heart to show him that she understood. Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and nodded at his father with the same solemn expression he had worn as a little boy when James was teaching him something important. The afternoon passed in a strange, peaceful suspension of time. They took turns sharing memories out loud, not because James needed to hear them, but because speaking them aloud made them feel more permanent, more real. Emma told the story of their first date and how James had been so nervous he had knocked over his coffee cup twice. She described how he had apologized so profusely that she had started laughing, and then he had started laughing too, and suddenly they were both laughing at nothing and everything. Sarah remembered the dollhouse, and how James would sit on the floor for hours, carefully painting tiny furniture. She talked about how he had made miniature books for the dollhouse library, and how she had found them years later and realized that he had actually written tiny stories inside them. Stories about brave princesses and kind dragons and houses where families lived happily together. Sarah had kept those tiny books in her jewelry box, and sometimes she would take them out and read the microscopic handwriting with the magnifying glass. Michael shared memories of learning to drive and how James had never once raised his voice even when Michael had made mistakes that would have sent other parents into panic. He talked about the treehouse and how James had taught him to measure twice and cut once, and how that lesson had applied to so much more than carpentry. "Think before you act," James had always said, "but don't think so long that you never act at all." James listened to each story with peaceful attention, his eyes bright with recognition and happiness. Sometimes he would nod slightly or squeeze someone's hand when they mentioned a particularly meaningful moment. Even without words, he was participating fully in this celebration of their shared life. As evening approached, Emma realized that James had given them exactly what they needed. Not dramatic final words, but a peaceful affirmation of all the love they had shared, and a blessing for the love they would continue to share with others. The last thing James did that day was reach for Emma's wedding ring with fingers that trembled slightly from the effort. He turned it gently on her finger, the way he had done countless times over their marriage, when he was thinking or content or simply wanting to touch her. It was his way of saying, "This promise we made, it doesn't end here. Love like ours doesn't have an expiration date." Emma understood completely, and she turned his wedding ring to completing their final conversation without saying a single word. The fifth day arrived with unusual sunlight streaming through the hospital window, casting everything in a warm golden light that seemed almost magical after the gray clouds of the previous day. Emma woke to find James looking at her with such peaceful contentment that for a moment she almost forgot where they were. His breathing was very quiet now, very gentle, like he was simply resting between one moment and the next. There was something different about his expression today, as if he had made peace with whatever was coming and was ready to embrace it, with the same quiet grace he had brought to everything else in his life. The morning light revealed small details that Emma had somehow missed during the darker days. The way James's hair caught the sunlight and showed threads of silver she had never noticed before. The peaceful set of his mouth that made him look younger, somehow, as if sleep had erased years of worry and responsibility. His hands resting on the pale blue hospital blanket looked strong, still despite everything that was happening. These were the hands that had built Sarah's dollhouse and taught Michael to use tools and helped Emma through countless nights, both joyful and difficult. Sarah and Michael arrived within the hour, as if they had sensed that today would be different. They moved more quietly than they had on previous days, and their faces held a mixture of sadness and something that looked almost like reverence. Emma could tell that they understood what she had already realized. James was ready to go, and his work of loving them was complete. Now he was preparing for whatever came next with the same thoughtful attention he had given to every important project in his life. The three of them arranged themselves around James's bed one final time, but instead of sadness there was something almost ceremonial about the moment, like they were participating in something sacred and natural and right. The morning sunlight seemed to bless their gathering, and Emma found herself thinking about all the Sunday mornings they had spent together as a family, James making pancakes while she and the children set the table. The comfortable chaos of newspaper sections scattered everywhere, and coffee cups and orange juice glasses, creating rings on the wooden table. Those Sunday mornings had been ordinary. At the time, just part of the rhythm of family life. But now, Emma realized they had been extraordinary in their own way. They had been moments of connection and belonging that had built the foundation of who they all were as people. James had never announced that he was creating memories or building family traditions. He had simply shown up consistently with love and attention, and the patience to let life unfold naturally. James looked at each of them with eyes that seemed to hold all the love he had ever felt concentrated into these final hours. There was no panic or distress in his expression, only a deep calm that reminded Emma of how he used to look when he was working on a particularly challenging carpentry project, focused and peaceful and completely present in the moment. James had always been someone who could find tranquility in the middle of chaos, and that quality was serving him well now. Around noon, James opened his eyes with sudden clarity and looked directly at Emma. Without words, he was asking if she would be okay if she understood that letting go was an act of love too. Emma nodded and whispered, "I understand. I love you enough to let you go." The words came from somewhere deep inside her that she hadn't known existed, a place of strength and wisdom that James himself had helped to build over their years together. Relief washed over James's features when he heard her words. Emma could see the tension leave his face and shoulders, as if he had been carrying a weight that he could finally set down. He had been worried about her, she realized. Even in his own time of transition, he had been concerned about how she would manage without him. This permission to go, this assurance that she would be okay, had given him what he needed to complete his journey in peace. Then James did something extraordinary that none of them would ever forget. He looked at each of his family members and pressed his hand to his heart, then reached out to touch each of their hearts in turn. The gesture was deliberate and meaningful, like a blessing being passed from one generation to the next. It was his way of showing them that love doesn't end with breathing, that the connections they had built would continue long after his physical presence was gone. This stays, the gesture seemed to say. This continues. This is forever. James was teaching them one final lesson about the nature of love and connection, that what mattered most between people existed in a realm beyond the physical world, that the influence of a life well lived rippled outward in ways that could never be measured or contained. Sarah understood first, and she pressed both hands to her heart, and then reached toward her father in the same gesture. Michael followed, and then Emma, and for a moment they were all connected in a circle of love that felt larger than the hospital room, larger than their individual grief. They were participating in something ancient and eternal, the passing of love from one soul to another. As the afternoon light began to change, James's breathing became even softer, even more peaceful. Each breath seemed to come from a place of deep rest, as if he was already halfway between this world and whatever came next. Emma found herself humming their wedding song again, and she could swear she saw him smile at the familiar melody. The song filled the quiet room with memories of their first dance and all the times they had danced together in their kitchen. While dinner cooked on the stove, Sarah held his left hand while Michael held his right, and Emma smoothed his hair back from his forehead the way she had done when he had fevers, when he was stressed, when he just needed comfort. They formed a protective circle around him, offering their presence as a gift. There was no need for conversation now, no need for anything except love and attention, and the willingness to stay with him until the very end. The end came so gently that at first they weren't sure it had happened. James simply breathed out one last time and didn't breathe in again. There was no struggle, no distress, just a quiet transition from presence to memory, from physical touch to eternal love. The machines continued their quiet beeping for a few moments before the nurses came in to turn them off, but James had already moved beyond their mechanical sounds. Emma continued, humming for a few more moments, finishing their song, and in the silence that followed she could swear she felt him still there with them, just in a different way. The love he had given them was still present in the room, still flowing between them like an invisible current that connected them to him and to each other. Later, when people asked Emma what James's last words were, she would smile and tell them that he had said everything he needed to say without speaking at all. Their love had been built on understanding that went deeper than words, and their goodbye had been perfect in its wordless completeness. Some conversations, she learned, were too important for mere words. They required the full presence of the heart, the complete attention of the soul, and the kind of love that speaks in gestures, glances, and the gentle pressure of hand-holding hand. The golden afternoon light continued to stream through the hospital window long after James had gone, as if the sun itself was offering comfort to those left behind. And in that light, Emma, Sarah, and Michael began the long process of carrying forward the love they had been given, transforming grief into gratitude, and loss into lasting connection.